It's not a plug to my book. It's rather, no. Rather, I'm flattered how many of you signed up for it. I want to put this line though. The only caveat I'll give. It is an academic book, so if you're looking for an armchair book like you pick up at the airport or Joel Osteen, this is not it. And don't pick up Joel Osteen because he's wrong. It is an academic book. So if you're buying it to support me, that's very kind of you. If you're doing it because you like me, that's even more kind of you. But just keep that in mind. Okay? I don't want people buying it and be like, oh, he wrote a book on it, and then being like, that's a lot of footnotes. So just keep that in mind. And if you already signed up and you decide you don't want to sign up, let Kelly know back there, like, you just erased my name. And she'll erase it off that list of people that want to buy it, and I won't know at all. So that's okay. It's okay. Thank you for being here. I appreciate all the support. And this is an important topic. I'm more excited, not that I wrote the book on this, literally, but that this is super important for the church, and we have nothing on it. Okay? And so I'm delighted that you're all here, that you have an interest in this aspect of our theology that Luther held is very important and spent a lot of time talking about. And over time, we have lost that on the way, and we'll talk probably a little bit about why that happened today. So when it comes to the book and its relation to this, in general, we'll be following loosely kind of where the book goes. But the book actually doesn't talk about a lot of things we're going to talk about because there wasn't space in here, actually, academically speaking, to talk about those things. So like today, we're going to talk a lot more about the issues we're facing today in America, especially regarding the occult. And we'll be looking at some things related to that we're just going to be having to deal with in the next generation, and why that matters for this topic as the church, as the people of God. So, as we go through today, we'll be talking just a general introduction to the idea of spiritual warfare, what it's about, how we ought to view it as Christians briefly, and then we'll be talking about how the world is handling these concepts right now, and kind of the general mess that it's in. So we'll see how long that takes us, and then we'll take whatever's left and just throw it into next week and just keep going from there. So we'll go until we're done. My goal is those to be done before Thanksgiving, or earlier. So don't feel like, oh no, I'm on it for 3 months. Hopefully not. All right, so we'll just hop right in. So when you think of spiritual warfare, what do you think of? Okay, the devil. All right, angels and demons. Hopefully not when we Dan Brown fix it, because that's awful. All right. What else? Anyone?
Unseen.
The unseen.
Job.
Job?
Yeah.
Book of Job. Tony.
Principalities.
Principalities. Ephesians 6. There we go. Yeah, Steve.
Our manhood against our Christian spirit.
I'm sorry?
Our manhood, man against our Christian spirit.
Okay. Our sinful natures at odds with us.
Attacks on our souls.
Okay. Okay, and when we look at these, we see some things, right? We see the spiritual nature of it here, right? It's not necessarily a physical attack on you, right? Or we see that there's an aspect to it that's not necessarily demonic. We see some other things in here ranging from demons to a little more different way of talking, right? The unseen and ghosts, right? We have specifically a book of the Bible right here, right? Job. And the idea that we saw the devil in there talking to God. And we'll look at that when we talk about the devil specifically. Okay. Yeah. So there's a lot of things, very broad when we get here, right? These are not small topics. Good and evil. Little font's a little small, sorry. God and Satan, right? Demons and angels, like you were saying. Natural and the supernatural, which gets to that unseen and the principalities, right? That in some way humans are involved in all of this. That there's a warfare going on, that in some way we have some kind of connection. And we'll talk about some of those different ways that people talk about that. And it's related, as was noted here, in the attack of the soul, and just in the name spiritual warfare, right? To my spiritual life and my faith. So we have a lot of these moves here in very broad topics. In just talking about good and evil, right? Now you're talking about ethics, to talk about God and Satan, you know, your theology of who God is and whether it's like a lot of false gods where you have kind of a dualistic, you have a good God and a bad God that are, you know, at odds with each other. We call that dualism. You know, you have the demons and angels and all of the accompanying mythology that goes with that kind of stuff, right? So there's a whole bunch of broad topics here. We're not going to talk about all of them. Okay, we're going to miss those. So just briefly, this is an overview of what we're going to talk about in part. When you look at the church specifically, there are four main views that the church is dealing with, or approaches that the church at large in the West takes. The first one is a dismissive, can't read that. First one is a dismissive view. Okay, this view states that when I read the Bible, all that stuff about miracles, anything about angels and demons, anything that is supernatural, it's all myth. None of it's real. Okay, so when they read the Bible, they say, okay, I'm just going to cut out everything that doesn't sound like reasonable logic. Okay, this is what Thomas Jefferson did with his Bible, most famously. He actually physically cut out all the parts he couldn't believe because they were not logical or rooted in scientific inquiry. Okay, the second one is the social view. This is related to that one, and it says, instead of saying, well, we just physically cut out all that stuff, it should be in the Bible, but you don't take it at face value. It's all symbolic. So when Jesus exorcises demons, he's not really exorcising demons because demons don't exist, but it's a lesson for us about how you fight oppression or speak the truth to someone that's dominating you or some other thing. Okay? So they try to take everything that looks like it's supernatural in the Bible, the miracles and everything else, and they say, well, we don't just chuck them out, but they actually don't mean what they say. They actually are symbolic for something else that we should learn from them. It's like a fable, okay, or a myth. They call it the demathologization of the Bible. That we take it and we look at it, instead of saying, this is God's word, we say, sort of God's word, and it has a bunch of lessons in it. Okay, so that's another way people take it, specifically towards social justice. It's almost always about oppression and government and corporations and that kind of thing. The third one I call pneumatic. That's just fancy for spirit related, because pneuma means spirit or breath. They're spirit focused, and the reason I say it that way, use pneumatic, is because this concept, like spiritual, is too broad and too weird. But this is where most of your Pentecostal literature is going to go. We'll look at all these later. We're Christians in the spirit fight against demonic control, demonic forces for control of the world. So the idea is that the world is owned by the devil, and somehow God can't do anything about it. And so God appoints us to go take care of it. Okay? And when I say it that way, it may sound absurd to some of you as Lutherans, but this is huge. Okay? This is probably the number one view in the world. At large. Okay. And social is probably the second view. The social justice one has really emerged. The third one, that's most popular, then is the last one there. I call it the Bifurcated View, which just means split in half. Because it's shorter than sitting split in half all the time. The idea there is you have the natural world, and then on a different level you have, obviously by the name of it, you have the supernatural world. And that those two really don't touch each other. Like, you might say it's real, but we can't really see it or touch it or experiment with it. So therefore, it's just this other thing that the Bible says is there, but other than maybe in a couple places in life, it touches that, otherwise it doesn't matter. Okay. So we'll be looking at these over time. So just kind of keep those in the back of your head as we're going forward. And we'll keep bringing them up. Okay. So I put them here at the beginning just so they're in your head a little bit. Questions on those? To bifurcate something means to split it in two. So if I give you a rundown of all these, of where they are in the church, you're very progressive people with the Bible, very much like today's groups that are very, like the ELCA, where they're like, yeah, whatever, like you can have a trans bishop and whatever, we don't care. They range between the dismissive, where none of that's real anyway, or to the social justice one, where everything in it's about social justice. The gospel itself is about social justice in their view. So of course anything related to it is also going to be lessons about fighting earthly oppression. And so all of your progressive denominations that have fallen into that cultural trap in the West, all of them fall into one of those top two views. Most of your Pentecostal focus on this third view. Okay. And that is this idea that we're filled with the Spirit to fight forces of evil. That's all over the Pentecostal world. A lot of your non-denominational denomination churches, which are just those ones that are out there like David Crank's over in off Grabway there, or Joel Osteen, or anyone you watch on Daystar. Don't watch Daystar. They're all with this view. How do you become the best person you can be to take back territory for God? Okay. The last view, the bifurcated view, is where our kind of traditional Western denominations are. So by and large, even our Lutheran Church in Missouri Synod, as it's kind of ran the last 100 years or so, but also our Roman Catholic brothers, most of your traditional denominations are right here. So they say the demonic is real. They really are demons. They're really supernatural. But what does that mean for your daily life? I don't know. It's kind of this weird subculture of our faith that we don't talk about much. Unless we have to because the readings call for it. Right? Other than that, we don't really talk about it. So that's where those four views are. Okay? Mine is the anti-fragile view, which is going to be the fifth one. That's not up there because no one else teaches it. Okay? But is confessionally Lutheran and biblically sound, at least so far. As far as I know. Okay. It's been through a lot of thought and a lot of work. So let's define a couple things. One of the problems I had in working on this over time is trying to even find a definition for the words spiritual warfare. I read over 130 books on spiritual warfare, and there were exactly 3 that define spiritual warfare. They all just assume that you're going to understand what they're talking about without actually defining the term, which is a problem. So I'll read this to you. I'm not expecting you to be able to read it because it's small. So there's a couple guys in 2007 said in their book, spiritual warfare is the conflict of 2 opposing wills, namely that of God and his followers versus Satan and his followers. Now, what might strike you about that? The conflict of two opposing wills. What does that sound like?
Dualism.
Equal. Excellent. Sounds like you have a good guy and a bad guy, and neither one can really get the upper hand, right? They're evenly matched, and they're trying to go around each other, and thousands of years later, they're still just wrestling. Or it makes you think of like the yin and yang of Buddhism, right? We have like the equal teardrop shapes, right? And they have to be in balance. Okay. Is that biblical? I'll give you the answer. The answer is no. Okay. But that's their definition. Okay. The second one, which I'll read to you. Greg Boyd writes, stated most broadly, spiritual warfare is a worldview, that perspective on reality which centers on the conviction that the good and evil, fortunate or unfortunate aspects of life are to be interpreted largely as the result of good and evil, friendly or hostile spirits warring against each other and against us. So in his view, what's happening is, again, two equal forces, evil and good, fighting against one another, and somehow we get caught in it, like, scooped up into it once in a while. Okay? And then the third one is C.S. Lewis, who I immensely, actually, he's a great author and a pretty good theologian. If you read him as a Lutheran, you probably agree with him on probably 80 to 85% of what he says, but there's some stuff we don't. Okay, this is one of them. He says, enemy-occupied territory, that is what this world is. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed, you might say, landed in the skies, and is calling us all to take part in a great campaign of sabotage. Okay? Now that's 1952. It is, and it's glorious. He has a great way with words. I love that guy. But it does take a little chewing to navigate him. What does that sound like? He's saying that the world is enemy-occupied territory, and God recruits Christians in order to do a great campaign of sabotage against the devil's work in the world.
God's not in control.
That the world really belongs to the devil. Okay, that's that pneumatic aspect of it, right? Yeah, Kathy.
Do you know where this quote is from?
From your Christianity.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Any other comments on that? All right. So, I'm going to propose a different definition because I did bother to actually define it. Okay. Biblically speaking, this is the most accurate definition I could muster after looking at this for, well, I'll talk about that since I was 11, so 36 years. Spiritual warfare is the powers of the fallen creation railing against the reign of Christ. So there's some things to unpack there that we aren't going to unpack right now on slides, but I'll just unpack briefly and we'll talk more about later. One is powers of the fallen creation. So there are three powers of the fallen creation, which we are very familiar with as Lutherans. What might they be? Give me one. World. What's the second one?
The flesh.
The flesh, right? Which is that sinful nature that someone brought up right there. What's the third?
The devil.
The devil. World, flesh, and the devil. Luther talks about these all the time. Okay, the world, the flesh, and the devil are the fallen powers of creation. So you have the self, which are sinful nature from birth, that's at odds with God. We'll look more closely at that later. We have the world, which is the conglomerate of people, because when we gather as a bunch of sinners, do we become less sinful? No, we don't, right? So, the grouping of sinners doesn't make us less sinful. Usually it just amplifies our sins, okay? And then the world's broken in sin as well because of the fall. And so we have things even in nature that are opposed to the right order of things as God originally had put together. And then, of course, we have the devil, the fallen angels with him. We will look very closely at that as well. You have all three of these then, okay? And what are they doing They are railing against the reign of Christ. Now, what is the reign of Christ? What's he doing right now? He's reigning from where? Heaven, right? And we'll look more closely at how he goes about doing that today. Okay? If he came back in all of his power and reigned so that everyone understood who he was, what would we call that? The last day. It would be Armageddon, right? This is the end. Christ has shown up in all of his glory to judge all things and usher in the last age. Okay? So, his reign today is not the same as his reign will be in eternity. There's a subtle nuance there, but significant for us in how he goes about reigning. So he is reigning over all things, and then this fallen creation, each for their own reasons, and we'll look at those, are all pushing back against that reality. Okay? But I want us to note something very clearly right at the outset here, and this is why we kind of set this up this way. Is there anything that Jesus does not reign over right now? No. Correct. The answer is no. He's God. He made it all. He rules over it all. He is victorious for us over sin, death, and the devil. For our sakes, in a way that would cause us to be his own. Was he already reigning over the devil and over death?
Yes.
Yes. Okay? But Jesus does it in such a way that now he does it for our good. Right? That he went and suffered and died for our sins and rose again so that he can reign not just in judgment and righteousness over sin, but also in judgment full of grace and mercy for the sake of his people, because he loves us. Okay? So that's the reality against which the fallen creation, the fallen powers, are pushing against that reality because they don't like it. Okay? So they're trying to deny that reality. And that's the world we live in right now. It's a world that constantly is pushing against the reality that Jesus rules and reigns over everything right now. And that's important for us to recognize as we go into it. Because the next part we're going to start looking at is, so what is the world looking at right now? What's the state of our Western world? And I'll tell you now already, it's a mess. So we'll take a look at it, and we'll recognize it for what it is, and you'll see how important it is right now to know that. And then from there, we'll start going into the biblical work of actually taking this apart. Great.
You chose Christ for a reason. Are you going to unveil it right now?
Sure. Why Christ?
Not God.
Well, Christ specifically, not God.
Right.
Because it's Christ that rules and reigns on account of what he's done for us. And then walks and then fights for us, as we'll see. The hymn, Luther's hymn, Mighty Fortress, is exactly right on that. Okay. Also, making sure that it's Christ because that's his title. Right? Jesus is his human name, which is awesome. But his title is the Anointed One of God. Right? He is God Christ. It's not his last name, right? It's a title. It's the God Christ. Oh yeah, every year my 8th graders are like, what? Like, no, it's not Jesus Christ, like John Ferguson. Okay. Any other comments on that? Okay, we will revisit this several times as we go along. All right. So just a quick overview. It's small. I'll just say it real fast. So first thing we're going to look at is the New Age and the occult. We're going to look at the world as it is right now. Then we're going to look at the church and the confusion within the church. So we'll look more closely at those different viewpoints. The dismissive, which we won't spend much time on because that's just dumb. And then the other 3 views that I talked about. Then we're going to look at more closely, specifically the fallen powers. What is at odds with God? And then from there we'll walk into, okay, so then how do we understand this whole thing? Having looked at the world as it is, having looked at what people are saying about it, how does the Bible really speak about it, and then how do we understand that for our daily lives? Okay, so that's how we're going to kind of move through this in the next few weeks. Questions or comments? Otherwise, we'll just move on. Okay? So now we'll move on to the next little section there about the world around us. Okay? It's a mess. Okay, so we'll start here. How many of you have had something in your life happen that you cannot explain? Most of us. Most of us have some kind of phenomenon in our lives where you're like, you look back, you're like, yeah, I don't know how that happened. Like, it could have been very paranormal in the sense of like, a thing happened where I encountered some kind of thing and it really was creepy and messed me up, and then I got out of it and moved on with my life. It could be some big near-death kind of movement, not necessarily near-death experience, but the idea of like, I thought sure in that moment, oh, we're so dead. And then we weren't. And I have no idea how that happened, right? It could be a lot of other things too. But these moments in life where we recognize, looking back, I'm like, I don't know what to do with that. Right? So I'll tell you about how I got into this, just to frame it for you. So when I was 11, well, before I was 11, I liked scary stories. Okay? I still do. I like creepy but not gory. Okay, that's my whole shtick. So those Time Life books, you remember those? For those of you that are, I'm dating myself, for those that are grew up in the 80s, there were these Time Life books that would always have on TV. They talked about like ESP, and they gave you all these stories about people who talked about how they had ESP, or if you want on ghosts, and it'd be all these ghost stories from like the world and America, and I loved that stuff. I'd read all of like those Alfred Hitchcock short stories. I'd always check them out from my school library. Just read that whole shelf on like supernatural stuff. I loved it because it was creepy, but I never found it scary. I didn't like gross, like I said before. I didn't like gross, but I liked creepy stuff, and I liked supernatural things. I like UFOs and cryptozoology and all that crazy stuff. Not a conspiracy theorist yet, but I probably had some of the makings of it. But here's what happened. And it goes with that third one on the all over on the right. When I was 11, I was in junior high. 12. I was in junior high, and so I was new school, big school, 7th and 8th grade. Went from a class of what, 33 to a class of 320, I think. And so you're finding friends, right? Because you're not with anybody that you were with in grade school at that point, just even statistically. So, so there was these 3 or 4 guys, we had a number of classes together, so we started hanging out. And then a few months in, probably around this time, maybe October, one goes, hey, having a birthday coming up. We're like, oh, cool. It's like, have you all over? And we'll hang out. Now, back in the 80s, for those of you that remember, which actually most of you, but 80s, that meant maybe movies on VHS. That meant video games on your Atari, and maybe a Nintendo if you're lucky. And it meant pizza, which still means pizza today. So we're like, yeah, of course, like that's awesome. So I went over to his house, and it turned out that we neither played video games, nor we did eat pizza. Neither played video games, nor did we watch movies. Instead, his parents were head priest and priestess of the 7 Arrow Shamanistic cult. And they used the whole night to try to recruit us. So we have these 6 12-year-old boys there who spent the whole night with these people who were doing all this magical incantation stuff. So the first part was, okay, this is weird. Bunch of hippies, right? This is Denver too, so you know, we dealt with hippies all the time. We're like, oh, big bunch of granolas. So, as we call them. But things happened that night that I couldn't explain. So they were trying to use plumb line to contact the spirits And things were happening with that were beyond just, oh, they're jiggling it in a weird way. I saw things in mirrors that moved that weren't there. Things got another phenomenon. And then there were points at which during that. So basically, I spent the whole night just praying that they wouldn't kill me. So I was like, what's next? Like, sacrifice? Take one of us and give me money, mo. So I didn't know what's going to happen. So I can laugh about it now. But it was really concerning then. So the whole night I was just praying inwardly because I'm not going to show up with praying. So I'm just praying inwardly that God would just get me through the night. Like, get me to tomorrow, and I'm out of here and will never come back, ever, which I didn't, of course. Periodically through that night, as they were doing all this crazy stuff, there would be a heaviness and weight to the room. It would just get heavy, tension, and I don't know how to really describe it other than just you felt a weight on you. And it got heavier, heavier, heavier. And just when I felt like I don't know what to do with this anymore, just instantly, gone. And this warm sense of peace came over me, like, don't worry, God's got me. Okay. About 3 times that night, that happened. It would slowly creep up again, and just when it was at, like, I'm not sure if I'm going to panic, just boom, gone. It would just throw up. So I was like, got out there, I was like, my mom goes, how was it? I was like, that was interesting. I don't know what to say to my mom, who's the nicest woman on the planet, about, okay, so, cultic rituals all night. She would have just, she wouldn't even know what to do with it, right? So I was like, so then I went to my pastor, and I went, Pastor, what? So hypothetically speaking, what if these kind of phenomenon happen? And his answer was, oh, that's not real. No, that's just stuff on TV. None of that stuff really happens. It's just con artists and whatever. I was like, are you sure? I don't know. He's like, yeah, he goes, it's all garbage. Oh, okay. So I was like, well, I'm pretty sure I'm not crazy, and I'm pretty sure I'm a fairly level-headed kid, even though I'm a kid. So what could this be? Does the Bible really have answers? Do we actually have something to say about what happened? And that sent me on this trek all the way to today. Okay. And in a certain sense, it has actually followed me all the way. Ever since that night, it has been a constant adventure interacting with this kind of thing, or people that are wrestling with this stuff. Okay, junior high, high school, college, grad school, seminary, vicarage, here, and then once people found out at like the synod that I do this, then all over the place, okay? But this is stuff that really is out there that we have to contend with, okay? And we'll take a look and learn more of why that is here in the next few minutes. Comments real quick. I saw some people maybe wanted to say something. Yeah, Carrie.
I just had a really quick question because I've had similar things.
Yeah.
And when I started looking into it, I was told if by another pastor at my church, we can have depression or like feel like something's holy. Have you ever had that? Like,
Yeah.
I feel like the minute I say like in the name of Jesus or whatever, then it goes away.
Yeah. So there's aspects to this that vary a little bit, but those things are there. We'll talk more about that stuff when we talk about the devil specifically.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious, did you get any sleep with us?
I actually slept really well. I slept really well because what I came out with was whatever that garbage was, as unsettling it was, God is bigger than that. He kept me through that. Every time I felt really uncomfortable, the peace followed, right? Prayer, God saw that prayer through. The 4 of those guys ended up joining the cult. So it was a very successful night, right? They saw crazy stuff. They didn't know what to do with it. Tell me more. Right? What do I do with this? I've never experienced this before, right? And rather than turning on all their alarms, they were like, oh, wow, I want to dig deeper, right? And we see that across the board, and we're actually going to talk about that now. What we're not going to talk about today, though, or during this, is cryptozoology. As much as I would like to, cryptozoology is Bigfoot. It is Loch Ness, okay? This often gets thrown into the same bucket as, like, the mysteries of the unknown, okay? This is just the study of animals we have not verified yet. That's really what this is. And as much as, if you look on Wikipedia, it's like the pseudoscience of, I'm like, well, some of the evidence might be wrong, and maybe not scientific, but it doesn't mean it's not. I mean, Coelacanth down in the bottom corner there, he was supposedly a fake beast of ancient times. People were like, hey, coelacanths are still around today. And people were like, oh, you're full of garbage. Like, dinosaurs don't exist, coelacanths don't exist. And then a couple of scientists were in a diner on the southern edge of Japan, and they got the special. They looked down, and the special was coelacanth. And they're like, where did this come from? They're like, oh, they're just out here. We harvest them all the time. And they're like, what? And they went out, sure enough, this thing that's supposed to have been extinct for millions of years was the special. So, that kind of stuff happens often. We are still discovering new species every year. So, the idea that there is a Loch Ness monster, the idea that maybe one of these plesiosaur kind of style things is still out in that wide world, maybe, right? So, we're not going to be talking about that any more than I just did. But it is very fascinating. Does North America have an ape? I don't know. But it doesn't have to do with this. Alright, you can watch all the Bigfoot specials if you want. They probably won't see anything, just so you know. Alright. So, what we are going to talk about, though, is where we are today and how we got here, and the time we have. So, there's two kind of threads we're going to be talking about. One is why so much of our world for so long stridently, and so for a whole bunch of people still do, stridently dismiss the idea of there being a supernatural existence. And that there's something beyond what we can actually concretely interact with. Okay. The Enlightenment, I'll just read this to you really briefly. This is how it affects the church. We talked about this in Bible class a year ago. Strauss wrote a book called Life of Jesus, where he excised all the miracles and everything out of it. And the comment in 1906 about this was, Strauss's Life of Jesus has a different significance for modern theology than it had for his contemporaries. For them it was the work which made an end of miracle as a matter of historical belief, and gave the mythological explanation its due. We, however, find in it a historical aspect of positive character, inasmuch as the historic personality, which emerges from the midst of myth, is a Jewish claimant of the Messiahship, whose world is purely eschatological. What he's saying there is, Jesus is a man. He's just a man, he's not God. Everything else is just myth. But what a guy, is what he's saying. And shouldn't we all strive to be like that myth of Jesus? Ultimately, he is the ultimate myth of what man can be, and so we should all be like him. That's what he's arguing here. Okay? So he's not arguing that the miracles aren't true. He's arguing that Jesus isn't real. So it's not just the myths, it's Jesus. Okay? Rudolph Goldman in the 1950s, that's a very famous quote by this particular theologian. He says, now that the forces and laws of nature have been discovered, we can no longer believe in spirits, whether good or evil. It is impossible to use the electric light and the wireless, for those of you that don't know, that's the radio, right? The wireless, and to avail ourselves of modern medical and surgical discoveries, and at the same time to believe in the New Testament world of spirits and miracles. Okay? So he's saying, the world of the supernatural is dead, science has killed it. No, it hasn't. Yeah, exactly. With contempt, which I appreciate it because that is true. All right. It is, we should take that with contempt. So the Enlightenment got embarrassed. Okay? But what we find is that during the whole time that they're saying God is dead, the Enlightenment has killed religion, killed the supernatural, there's a whole other movement going on. Take a look at it a second. Going all through, in fact, very popular people. This is a book by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. What's he famous for? Sherlock Holmes. When he thought about science, he thought, well, surely we can use the empirical inquiry and apply it to the supernatural. Let's talk to spirits and see what they have to say. So he wrote this book this is not a first edition, but this version is from 1919. The first one was 1898. Speaks with authority, scholar, physician, writer, recently been devoting his life to the one absorbing subject, are the dead really dead? The book, the vital message, the blending of two phases of existence, the ascent of the material plane to the spiritual, to a gate that to a wonderful land which stretches so clearly before the eyes, open to see it. Okay. So, he says there's ways to talk to the dead. Sir Oliver Large wrote a book, Raymond Life or Death. He was a well-known physicist in his day, same time as Conan Doyle. And his son died unexpectedly. And he was very grieved because he was very close to his son, so he spent the rest of the time trying to contact his son through spirits and mediums and other empirical means to be sure it was his son, and wrote a whole book about it. Okay? He's good friends with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. These are sirs, by the way, right? The Sir of literature and a Sir of science, right? Knighted by Queen. And then this one is on the other aspect of that. So not only these guys kind of exploring it, but who did they explore it with? And it turns out there were whole societies in the West that were built around spiritual mediums. People that said they could talk to the dead. And so this book is about one called Eusapia Palladino and her Phenomena. And there were a whole bunch of people like this. Helen Blavatsky, who talked about how they could do these supernatural things, these paranormal detections of the other world, and then would tell people about their stuff. Do we still see that today?
Yes.
Yes. Where?
I can tell you.
Psychics. What? I'm sorry?
March 23, 2001, my father is dying in the Philippines. I was here, and he showed to me, and he told me that he's ready to go. And I said, no, you're gonna get well. And he said, no, I'm ready to go. So then he disappeared. And after that, at 8 o'clock in the morning, because it's not around 11 o'clock, at 8 o'clock in the morning, my cousin called me. And she said, sit down. I said, I know already. My brother is dead.
Yep.
She said, how do you know? I said, he was talking to me.
Yep.
And I explained to her, I said, he was wearing the bold polo shirt that we gave him.
Yes, you described what he was wearing and everything, and it was right? It was
Everything,
correct.
that's all we wear.
So, I'll tell you now, Judy is not crazy. Right? And I've heard that kind of thing before, right? So, one of the things we'll look at, we won't have time to next week, is we'll look at the Bible and talk about some of those things. There are things that we cannot explain, that the Bible actually makes reference to, that we just have to kind of roll with. But what are the boundaries on that God places on those kinds of things? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that in light of what the world is talking about. Because the world takes that stuff and just goes all crazy with it. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things you can't explain that happen, just like that. Okay? And that those things may be from God. And we have to recognize that too. So we don't want to take the modernist reaction of the Enlightenment and say, well, what'd you eat that night? Because that may have just been a weird thing. What a coincidence, right? Not necessarily, right? Right? So, what could it really be? Well, it could be God helping them to understand this for whatever reasons for her and her father, right? So we'll talk about how do we handle that stuff? How do we handle it when our friend comes to us and talks about those kinds of moments, or a recent loss of a loved one, and that loved one they are 100% certain came and reassured them that they are in a good place and everything's good. Right? Do we just say, well, that's not real, right? Like, well, but what does that mean, and what extent, how do we understand that as Christians? That's where we have to walk a little bit too. And my book doesn't go there, but we will. Okay, we'll talk about some of that stuff. So, and that gets us to this, what I was just talking about, what I call the second thread of thought. So instead of everyone just flying into the modernist movement of just whatever's concrete, whatever you can experiment on, that's real, everything else isn't. Okay? There's a second thread of thought. James Randi is the guy here who has since passed away. He, for 50 years or so, had a running thing where if you could show paranormal phenomenon like psychic stuff, ESP, telekinesis, all stuff, under laboratory-controlled conditions, he had a whole pot of money to give you. By the time he retired in 2015, it was $1 million. It's like, just come, sit, we'll put you in an experimental position where we can monitor everything and measure everything and show us that you can do the thing. And you're famous for doing it. Nobody ever claimed the money ever. They could never do it in the controlled environment. Yeah, great.
I have a personal story about him. 80 through 83, I worked at Washington University in the physics department, and one of the professors was a Dr. Phillips, who was really into trying to find this, just like he was doing, trying to find people that had ESP. So they put ads all over the country, invited people to the university. You have this skill set. They put them at a hotel. They gave them a stipend. So if Dr. Phillips couldn't figure out what it was, they'd send him down to the machine shop where I worked, and the three of us would try to debunk him. And I'll give them credit. There was all of them were either really good at sleight of hand. I mean, sometimes you couldn't see what they were doing, but 100% of them were debunked. All right, some of them were just silliness. A globe with a copper rod with a brass propeller, and he would do this, and it would turn. But he was always wearing flannel, and my boss came in with a flannel shirt, put up his hands on, and did the same thing. And, static electricity. Some of them were ridiculously powerful. I watched a guy bend a 5/8 steel bar with his hands, telling us he was just doing it with his mind. I mean, I give him credit. That man was a monster. But that's not ESP stuff. So where he comes in, there was one guy that none of us could figure out what he was doing. And it turns out James Randi had hired him, sent him to Dr. Phillips. Dr. Phillips thought he had the real deal. So PBS had a special that Dr. Phillips was on St. Louis, all over the country. Dr. Phillips goes on stage with this guy to introduce him to the world. And the guy right there made Dr. Phillips look like an idiot, said, no, I'm working for James Randi, I'm just a sleight of hand guy, and then the end showed right there. I mean, James Randi made Dr. Phillips look stupid for no reason other than just because he could.
Oh yeah, make no mistake, James Randi was a big jerk.
Oh yeah.
Okay, he really was. He's an atheist, he's a hardcore atheist, and if you know most hardcore atheists, they're jerks. They're very egotistical, they're very narcissistic, and he was very much that. But he also was very imperative when it came to this kind of stuff. And he found that no one could ever do it. So on one hand, you have to scrape aside by like Arthur Doyle and others to really kind of find out about this stuff. But in the end, you cannot ascertain what is outside of the natural, hence the word supernatural, with the natural things. You just can't do it. They're not integrated in that way. Okay? In a different way, but not that way. So we have to keep that in mind. So just help myself. So why does this matter for us right now at all? This is why it matters. We'll look more of these next week. So this is what showed up next to the manger scene at the state capitol of Illinois last Christmas. Because the Church of Satan said, hey, that's not separation of church and state, we want our thing there. Now, is there in any religion, even in Satanism, a story about the goat demon baby Satan being born? No. Okay? So they just made up this thing and had someone make it just to put it next to the baby Jesus, just to make people angry. Because there's no religion around that narrative. There's no story around it. Okay? The other one is After School Satan. This just came up because it's also not only in Illinois, but it's also being dealt with in Michigan and Wisconsin, I think. It's a club for after school, for junior high, of course, where you go in and it promotes self-directed education by supporting intellectual creative interests of students, is what they say. Satan's their mascot. They're not really worshiping Satan. They say what they're doing is using Satan as this, you don't need God as a crutch mascot in order to help people become more self-directed and self-motivated. So your life is what you make of it. You don't need a God. You just become the best you can be. Isn't that a positive message? Right? But they're still using Satan for it. So you're like, well, okay, so really with this and that, as goofy as it looks, right? Like, you are not getting away from the reality that you're telling people to address the devil as an idol in which they should respond and who they should emulate. Okay, so it is a religion that they're pushing on these kids as some kind of supposed secular thing with the devil as a mascot, like the St. Louis Cardinals have Cardinals as a mascot, right? It's the devil, he's my mascot, right? Which is different from like the Blue Devils of Duke, right? That is a mascot. They don't care about the fact that the devil. Their idea is just like we're crafty and powerful, like that kind of idea, like the Vikings, right? They were murdering masses, and everyone's like Vikings in Minnesota, right? At Green Park, we're like Vikings, right? And I'm like, I mean that's my descendants, but they all came to faith, so hey, we're good. But that's a problem, right? It's a problem. And we'll see next week why, where this is coming from. Is not just what we talked about last year, about this move of the secular culture to like secular Marxism with like trans movements and identity politics and stuff. There's something even deeper going on here with the crisis of faith in our Western culture at large, not just America. So next week we'll get further into that, and we'll keep going from there. What a great note to end on. All right. Well, let's pray before you go. Heavenly Father, you know even better than we do the powers that are assailing us every day, that are trying to drive a wedge between us and you. We pray, Lord, that your Spirit continue to guide us and be with us, that we ever attend your word and our faith, that in the face of such craziness in the world as what is before us there, that, Lord, you are reigning and ruling over all things. Help us, Lord, to navigate these days faithfully and boldly. Help us not to cower in the face of the shouting down of your truths, but rather to stand firm on the foundations that we have in you, because they are the only eternal ones that we have. We pray, Lord, that you would grant us your grace and peace, knowing that we are your children, joy even in these days, protection from harm and danger, and from the evil foe. We ask these things in Christ Jesus. Amen. Please be here. Come back. Come back.